district library consultant for the state of Iowa, and you had a 3-hour drive to get here.
2 hours and 15 minutes.
We appreciate you coming. She's presented on a variety of topics at several national library conferences, including ALA, ARSL, ALSC, PLA, and are there any more
Probably
acronyms?
doesn't mean a lot to me. It means library, but
There's refreshments back there, as Laura said. The restrooms are across the hall. The books are back there. So you check anything out. She'll give the presentation. There were some questions submitted to her, which she'll answer either during the presentation or afterward. I don't know. There's not going to be like a discussion. I know at one point we just talked about that.
But we'll see how much time we have.
So, other than that, over to you.
All right. I think my mic is working, and I know you have a camera on, but I tend to walk around when I speak, so you might have some trouble with that one. Well, thank you for having me here today. I have to say, I don't usually partake of refreshments when I go places because I really try to watch what I eat, but I love donuts. I absolutely love donuts. So I went back there and I just judiciously took a half of one that looked really yummy. It was a pumpkin donut. I've lived in Iowa for 11 years and I have not yet found a good pumpkin donut that compares with the wonderful donut shop, local donut shop that was in my hometown back in Indiana. This one was good. I don't know where you got it from, but it was really, really good. So the pumpkin donuts here at Independence. As Ben,
It's funny, I have a brother named Ben.
Tim.
I'm Sam.
Sam.
And I have a brother named Tim.
That is good.
This guy back here said. I'm Maryann Mori, and I am a district consultant for the state library. I'm not the district consultant because there's 6 of us, and you have one that represents Northeast Iowa, which is what you're part of. And I'll tell you in a minute why you're stuck with me instead of her. So let me preface everything I say here today with this clarification. I normally never use notes for my presentations. I just don't like that style. The only time I use notes is if I'm reading a quote from something. So this is not going to be my usual style of presenting. However, since I anticipate returning to Independence in January to present the same information for those individuals who couldn't be here this morning, I am reading every bit of my presentation in order to ensure that both groups receive identical information. So please bear with me as I read to you and just know that this is not my usual presentation style. So with that, I am Maryann Mori. There's my name up there. And as I said, I'm a consultant with the state library. I've been invited here to talk about city and library relations. So I anticipate that this presentation will take the bulk of our first hour, and during the second hour I will address 10 questions that were given to me by your library. We had allocated 2 hours this morning. We'll see how quickly I read everything, and we may have some time then at the end that we can take additional questions and or ask for clarifications, etc., whatever you need. So I originally gave a short version of this particular presentation, your library, the Autonomous City Department, for the Iowa City and County Management Association Conference in Iowa City this past spring. And I was then invited to give this presentation in a little bit longer version, which was nicer, at the Iowa League of Cities Conference held in September in Dubuque. And I believe it was one of your council members who attended my session there in Dubuque. Is he here?
He's not here.
And I'm sorry I don't recall his name. I should. Bob. Okay, yeah, that sounds familiar. But he attended that session and liked what he heard, and it's my understanding that he recommended I give this presentation here in Independence for the library board of directors as well as for the city council and officials. Although your library has its own district consultant serving Northeast Iowa, as I mentioned, she recommended I be here today since I was the person who created and originally presented this information. So that's the background of why I'm here and not a regular consultant. So in my presentation at Dubuque, I only briefly mentioned the state library by clarifying that we are not a regulatory agency. I always say this is the only badge I have. It's a name tag, and most of the time I forget to put it on. We exist primarily to educate and assist public library trustees and staff. It is also the state library's legal responsibility to develop and oversee standards for public libraries. Those standards are used to determine the amount of state tax dollars distributed to public libraries. And the state library's offices are located in the Miller Building in downtown The public portion of the State Library is located in our beautiful law library of the State Capitol building. And I will now go through the presentation as I gave it at the Iowa League of Cities conference, only as I said, I will be deliberately reading from my notes, which I did not do there. By the way, the State Law Library has been on a list of most beautiful libraries, not just in Iowa, not just in the United States, but in the world. So if you've never seen it, I encourage you to go down there and look at it. It's gorgeous. So what do you think of when you think of the word library?
Books.
Yeah. And that's what most people think of. And is it any wonder? Because if you do a Google image search for books, or a Google image search for library, this is what comes up. Picture after picture after picture of books. But in reality, these are much more accurate pictures of public libraries in the 21st century. Public libraries are vibrant gathering places for education, discussion, literacy, and socialization. In many of our small towns, libraries are the place, the one and only place for such activities. This screenshot is what's known as a word cloud, and it comes from the Urban Libraries Council, which said about the word cloud, this word cloud image was created by our library members' mission statements. The size of the words is determined by the frequency of mentions throughout all those mission statements. So do you see the word books up here?
Very small.
Very small. Way up at near the very peak of it, you see the word books in small print. It's not overly noticeable. But you do see reading and literacy, but those are not the most prominent words either. The most prominent words are information, ideas, community, people, and learning. Those are the focuses of public libraries today. So let's start to bring this all home to Iowa. I'm going to ask you the burning question that I'm sure you're all dying to know, or at least that's what I thought the people at the Iowa League of Cities would be dying to know. How many public libraries are there in Iowa? Anybody have a guess?
2,300.
2,300, oh my goodness. Not quite that many.
544.
Oh, you're really good. Actually, it's 543.
Ooh, close.
Yeah, there are 543 public libraries in Iowa, and that ranks 4th nationally as far as the states with the highest number of PLs. And in case you're curious, we are behind New York, Illinois, and Texas. With rare exception, all these libraries are city-owned and operated. Exceptions would be endowed libraries, but even then, cities still have a vital funding role, and the libraries are considered city-owned as opposed to private facilities open to the public. 47% of these libraries serve populations of less than 1,000, according to fiscal year 17 stats. As of fiscal year 18, and this information is from my colleague who oversees the State Library Accreditation Program, 483, or nearly 90%, 89.5 really, participate in the accreditation program, which is the system of standards I mentioned earlier that were required by law to establish. And 363 libraries, or almost 70%, are fully accredited by the state library. And again, accreditation equals sets of standards or best practices that libraries must follow or meet in order to obtain levels of state funding. There are 3 county systems in Iowa, those being in Dubuque, Scott, and Woodbury. So now I would ask, who do you think is on the library team? Did you know you have a team? Who would you say is part of the library team?
The library board members.
Library board members, 3 trustees, and what did you say?
Local people.
The local people, the people of your city. Who else?
Employees.
That's the library staff. Anybody else? It's actually a pretty big team. These are the members. The community, as you mentioned, residents of your city, but also rural residents of your county and members of other communities that may use your library through open access. City government is one of your team members. That's your city council, city administrator, other city department heads, and city employees. County government would be your county board of supervisors. The board, that's your library board. The Board of Independence is comprised of 9 trustees, and I assume those positions are This is one of your team members, that's Laura. Your staff, as you mentioned, anyone else employed at the library. Laura, how many staffers do you have here?
Usually, wait, no, no.
Yeah, just as she took a bite.
Well, it's confusing because we have three that are just as needed, but we have 9 typically, 3 as needed, and then we add one in the summer.
Okay, so roughly 9 plus. And you have donors, hopefully. I see a donor board out there in your entryway. Often those donors aren't library users, believe it or not, but they are people of the community who still believe the importance of a city library for the benefit of the community. And then the state library is one of your team members. We are the organization that supports public libraries in Iowa. So because I was only given a short period of time at those other conferences, and because I'm sure you'll appreciate having a short period of time this morning as well, I am only going to pass along 5 top things to remember, only 5. After consulting with some of my colleagues, we believe these are the 5 best things to know in order to greatly improve relationships between the city and your local library, its director, staff, and trustees. So number 1, the library is a city department. Your local public library even bears the name of your city, and it's also likely that the majority of the library's funding comes from the city's general fund. The library should be connected and interconnected with all other departments in your city. Just like the fire department, police department, parks and rec department, and public works department, the library is one of those departments. The library director is a city department head who manages a relatively large agency budget, a city building, and a staff obligated to adhere to legal, ethical, educational, and professional standards that are constantly evolving and changing. The director is responsible for serving each and every resident of the city to that resident's satisfaction. This is an important job within the city, and the position deserves respect as well as a salary commensurate with other department heads who have similar job requirements and duties. While I'm not equating the library exactly with police and fire, which are emergency services, the library is essentially an essential service in your community, and it should be treated as such. And in fact, I will dare to say that your average citizen has reason to utilize the public library far more than utilize your fire department, which is not to underestimate the value of firefighters. And we can be thankful that most of your citizens don't have reason to utilize the fire department. But my point is that it's likely no other city department directly affects and interacts with your citizens to the extent that your public library does, and often on a daily basis. Sadly, in town after town, we at the state library see the library as the very first department to go on the chopping block when funding gets tight. And even sadder, I know of cities that have only chopped the library's budget during those tough financial times. As I've been known to say, and as many other librarians have likewise observed, if you plan to cut your library's funding, then plan to invest more in your local police force. I don't think a lot of cities realize the extent to which libraries are keeping kids and some of your adult residents entertained and occupied in worthwhile activities instead of allowing them to run on the streets and possibly get into trouble. Realize that the relationship between library employees and other city employees is pretty much the same, although the library board has unique authority to set the compensation of library employees without the council's approval. Library employees must be offered all the benefits other similarly situated city employees are offered. If your city has regular department head meetings, the library director should be included in those. Your library director should also be providing regular reports to city council, quarterly or semi-annually as recommended, and providing information to the county supervisors. Because the library is a city department, this also means that the city should be maintaining the library's building, shoveling its parking lot and sidewalk, and caring for its physical facility the same way the city takes care of its city hall or any other city-owned facility. Note, although all of your city library employees are city employees, they are not overseen by city administration. The library board, or the library director, is overseen, that is hired, evaluated, and fired if necessary, by the library board. And all other library staff are hired, evaluated, etc. by the director. And I will discuss this aspect in more detail in our second hour, which will answer some of your questions that specifically related to this topic. As I told the attendees at the Iowa League of Cities conference, I won't embarrass some of you by asking when the last time Public Library, but if it's been a while or never, stop by, get to know the director, attend a program, visit after school sometime, get to know the difference your library is making in your community. Number 2, library boards are administrative boards. For those of you who may be relatively new to the position, and I was talking there to the League of Cities, so to city administrators, clerks, etc., library trustees are appointed by the mayor and approved by the council. In some cases, when a library board includes a rural resident as a trustee, the Board of County Supervisors may approve the appointee. This should all be spelled out in the library's ordinance, which I'll address later, and in the next point, actually. Unlike your city's planning and zoning board or the Parks and Rec board, both of which are advisory boards, the library's board is an administrative board. There are only 3 out of the 543 libraries in Iowa that do not have this type of board, this administrative board. So what this means is that rather than just providing input that the city can take or leave, the library board has authority. For this reason, the city council or county board of supervisors has no role in approving the library's bills, the hiring of library personnel, including the director, any of the library board's policies, or any of the library's programming choices. These are not within the council's or the county's purview. All this being said, I think it's wonderful when the city appoints a city council member to serve as a library board liaison, to attend library board meetings as a way to share city updates and concerns, and to hear library updates and concerns. I used to be a public library director here in Iowa, and I had such a liaison on my board when I was a director. And his attendance at those library meetings meant he fully understood our dire need to have another employee, and it was his action at the budget hearings for the city that got the funding for that position. I also want to add this comment from one of my colleagues, another district consultant, and this is her quote: "Make sure the mayor appoints and the council approves the right people as library trustees. Being on a library board is a much bigger job than most people, often even city council members, realize. So it is important to make sure those individuals appointed are willing to spend time, learn the job, and do what is best for the library and the community. Keep in mind that the word trustee contains the word trust. The city is trusting those individuals to oversee a city department, its staff, and finances. The state library has consultants, such as I am, who provide free training to library boards, and that's for new and veteran trustees. The state library also provides a wealth of information for trustees, such as publication of the State of Iowa Trustees Handbook and many webinars that are offered throughout each year and or are archived on our website and or that we will come and present in person. Number 3, the library's ordinance is unique. The library's ordinance is basically the library's birth certificate. It was adopted by the city council. It was adopted by the city council, and it dictates the setup of the library. And that is the composition of the board and the duties or the charges of the board. This is a huge issue we deal with at the state library. The fact that cities believe they can change the library's ordinance just as any other city code would be changed, but this is not the case. And I'm quoting from the In Service to Iowa book right now, which is the set of standards that the state library is required to establish, by law we're required to establish these for public libraries. And this says, most of Iowa's public library boards have the type of authority referred to as administrative authority. I mentioned that in the previous slide. This authority is granted to public libraries in Iowa by virtue of 2 documents, namely the Code of Iowa Chapter 392.5, which is on the slide, and your local library ordinance. As administrative boards, Iowa public library boards typically have the power to hire and evaluate the library director, determine salaries and compensation for the director and the library staff, establish the library's line item budget within the funding limits established by the city council, oversee spending and approve the library's expenditures, develop and adopt policies for the library's operation, engage in active short-term and long-term planning for the library's future, end quote. The statewide authority of the local library ordinance is given by this Code 392.5. Now, while the city council approved the original ordinance, the city council has no authority to revise the library ordinance. As I said, this is very very different from your other city ordinances and codification process for those. The library board also has no authority to change or amend the ordinance, nor does your director. As you can see from Iowa Code 392.5, I'll just read it here. A proposal to alter the composition, manner of selection, or charge of a library board, or to replace it with an alternate form of administrative agency is subject to the approval of the voters of the city. So the library ordinance can only be changed by a vote of your citizens. This means if you want to change how many trustees you have, or add a rural representative, or if you think the city administrator should oversee the library director, or you want the board members to be elected instead of appointed, or if you think only city council should approve library bills, or you think you're just going to close the doors on the library, any of those actions must be voted upon by your citizens. A couple of quotes here from some of my colleagues. Library ordinances must be changed by a referendum vote at a regular city election, not by the council's usual method of amending the city code. The ordinance is protected by state law. If your new library director has inherited an updated library ordinance and learns the changes were made in accordance with state law, or learns that the changes were not made in accordance with state law, the error will need to be corrected. In the event that your library ordinance was not originally set up in a legal fashion, such as a recent case with two libraries, their cities had approved ordinances that had city council members serving as trustees, which is an illegal action, or in the event that the ordinance was changed in a significant manner without a vote of the public, you will need to contact your city attorney to rectify the situation. And number 4, library budgetary control is overseen by the board. This point is a continuation of the last one since it pertains to the library's ordinance and the same state code. The library's ordinance states that the library board has authority over the library's budget, and it is the organization that approves the expenditures. It is that organization, meaning the library board, that approves expenditures and controls gifts and bequests to the library. This authority is granted by that same code I mentioned earlier, State Code 392.5, which says a library board may accept and control the expenditure of all gifts, devices, and bequests to the library. According to state code or state law, every incorporated city and every county is required to pay for library services. That code number is 256.69, and it stipulates a measly 6 3/4 cents per $1,000 of assessed property value. This unbelievably low amount is because the code is very outdated. It's from the 1970s. Libraries could not keep a light bulb burning at that rate. So realize that while the mandated rate is not realistic, the mandate to fund libraries is very real. Cities that don't have their own libraries should contract with neighboring cities that do have libraries and pay an equitable fee for their citizens to use that other town's library. Counties should likewise be paying an equitable amount for library services for rural residents. While the library board does have authority over the library's finances and expenditures, this does not exempt the library from properly providing financial information to the city. In fact, the trustee's handbook, which I mentioned earlier, clearly states, quote, while the library board has the authority to decide how library funding is spent, it still needs to report all income and expenditures to the city. We consultants routinely encourage our library boards to work in good partnership with their cities regarding all aspects, including financial ones. Chapter 9 of the trustee's handbook, which is freely available from the state library's website, deals entirely with library funding, finance, and budget. This is why I don't usually read from notes, because I just point out things and talk about things, but I'm going to stick to my script here. Again, realize that the library board has control over the library's finances and has the authority to approve expenditures that fall within the legal practices of the library's approved budget. That being said, you can see on this slide that it's the city clerk's role to pay those expenditures approved by the library board. I will interject here and say sometimes it's a city finance officer, not necessarily the clerk. When I was a director, we had both of those positions. That's not overly usual in a lot of our small libraries. But regardless, is that city that pays the expenditures approved by the library board and to provide the library with monthly reports showing paid expenditures and the status of the budget. council and mayor are shown to be responsible only for appropriating the bottom line funding for the library. Since the board has total authority over how the library's money is spent, the most the city council can do in the way of approving library expenditures is to rubber stamp the trustees' approval as a mere formality. If the council were to fail to approve an expenditure approved by the library board, a court would most likely fall back on the board's power to spend the library's money, which is authorized by ordinance, and remember that ordinance is based on state code, making the council's disapproval moot. While the city clerk and city council should be kept informed of the library's expenditures and the status of the library's budget on a monthly basis, the council has no real legally recognizable power to disapprove expenditures already approved by the library board. That being said, we advise librarians and library trustees of the following information from the Iowa League of Cities as provided in their clerk's manual. And this is a quote. After the board approves library bills and the general operation of the library director should coordinate information with the city finance officer to ensure the bills are added to the list of claims provided to the city council and published. This ensures that the expenditures are published in accordance with requirements in the Iowa Code and that the general ledger is kept current. While this is not mandated, both the auditor of the state and the State Library of Iowa encourage this preferred method. As with any other department, the library cannot spend more than has been allocated unless the budget is formally amended. Accordingly, the library and the city must work together to determine whether a formal budget amendment is required to account for possible expenditure overages or unanticipated revenues. It is often beneficial for the city council to receive a monthly or quarterly financial report from the library board to help ensure the library's budget is fiscally sound. End quote. And again, that was from the clerk's manual published by the Iowa League of Cities. Number 5, only 5, remember? The library provides powerful community impact and contributes to economic development. The old saying is you get what you pay for, and as I told attendees at the League of Cities conference, if your city library is less than desirable, which obviously yours is not, consider looking at how much the city is investing in it. Hands down, your city's library is likely your best return on investment, and there are probably fewer areas of the city that are frequented by all members of the community, regardless of age or social status. Your local library is likely providing these types of programs and services, among others: early childhood literacy and school readiness programs and classes, after-school activities, homework help, computers and Wi-Fi for job applications, resume writing, e-gov access, homework completion, and online information needs. Databases, including career and school readiness databases, foreign language training, and the ability to search the deep web where Google can't go. It's also providing senior socialization, lifelong learning for all ages, often office needs such as copying, faxing, printing, sometimes laminating, test proctoring, notary services, tax preparation help, personal assistance with information pertaining to all manners of life such as college prep, financial literacy, health and wellness, genealogy, legal, and local resources. And of course, it also provides books, ebooks, and other electronic resources, movies, music, newspapers, magazines, and often things such as sewing machines, sports equipment, musical instruments, cake pans, games, and puzzles. All of those things are in some of the libraries here in Iowa as part of their circulating collections, along with maker spaces and assorted databases and online subscription services. Libraries are democratic by nature, resources that are open and available to all, products of the common good, and places that foster a unifying ethic. According to an article titled 23 Reasons Why Your Library is the Most Important Place in Town, libraries help build or revitalize struggling or depressed neighborhoods and downtowns. Like a major department store in a mall, libraries attract large numbers of people, creating economic opportunities for a myriad of businesses and organizations in the surrounding area. Many libraries have become the hubs of vibrant neighborhoods, and that's a quote from that article, 23 Reasons Why Your Library is the Most Important Place in Town. So these are some examples from right here in Iowa. Scott County Library System headquarters in Eldridge, they remodeled an empty grocery store, which repurposed an empty building, and it brought new businesses to that part of town. Davenport's Public Library's Eastern Avenue branch is a real-life example of if you build it, they will come. The library library was part of a planned development and was all by itself when it was built. Within a couple of years, there are entire neighborhoods surrounding it. Almine Public Library was part of a major community renovation that included an aquatic center, sports complex, performing arts center, waste treatment plant, early childhood center, among others, that resulted in new business with 375 new jobs. Another of my consultant colleagues has said this, quote, "A public library is one of the last places in the community that you can just be. There is no expectation that you have to register or pay tuition or be there and to spend money. It's a public space that allows citizens freedom to pursue things that are very important to real progress in life, such as finding a new job, learning something new, or just having time to think about life in the manner in which they see fit, without an expectation that they pay the bill and leave the table. It's a mental health safe place, a safe space where people can decompress and find joy." That's from my colleague Jay. I said this to the Iowa League of Cities attendees. "I encourage you to consider devoting significant resources to helping library staff cope with difficult and mentally ill patrons, as well as unattended children and dependent adults and teenagers with too much time and energy to stay out of trouble. Surely all these groups would benefit, as would the community, from services targeted to these particular groups that use city employees for unintended purposes, which creates legal liability for the city. I often tell my story of my 3 realtor acquaintances in 3 different states. I once asked each of them individually what people look for when they relocate to a new location. They all said the same thing. People with families first ask about the schools, but the second question asked is, what's the library like? People move to cities with nice libraries. So this is the section in the League of Cities conference where I took them to show just a few ways that libraries are actively helping your citizens become better citizens toward better economic development for the entire community. Libraries have for many years provided job and career development assistance. When the legislature closed the bulk of the remote Iowa workforce development offices, public libraries were designated as the go-to substitute location for assistance. We took on the additional duties and challenges, turning our libraries into remote workforce development locations by providing hardware and software, as well as personal assistance from the local librarian, all within the local library facility. The legislature now funds the purchase of a career development resource that has replaced the Iowa Workforce Development Specific Resources. And BrainFuse is the name of that resource. It's the newest acquisition in this area, all available without charge to all public libraries in Iowa. I don't have time today to tell you too much about it, but I encourage you to ask Laura about it. She'll be happy to demonstrate it to you. Or you can access it without charge yourself by using your library card. Additionally, the state library is working more closely with Iowa Workforce Development to partner on Future Ready Iowa initiatives that we are promoting to our libraries. And if you're not familiar with Future Ready Iowa, it's an initiative out of the governor's office to help provide career training to unemployed or underemployed individuals in order to help ensure Iowa has a sufficient workforce for the demands and openings the state will have for skilled labor by the year 2025. I will add that in addition to providing BrainFuse, libraries often provide career fairs, programs on resume writing or college application processes, etc. Libraries have likewise been providing financial literacy to residents, books on budgeting, investing, banking, journals such as Value Line and Consumer Reports, Money Smart Week activities, and even smart investing classes, which were offered at many of our public libraries here in Iowa as a result of the grant the state library received. And this logo here, you see a Money Smart Week. That's an annual event. It's been in existence since 2002. It developed from a partnership between the American Library Association and the Federal Reserve Bank. It annually highlights financial literacy awareness at public libraries with partnerships among libraries and local financial institutions. Presentations, links to information, contests, kids events, including a piggy bank parade, online links to financial literacy games, etc., are all things that Money Smart Week provides and endorses and encourages libraries to do. Libraries are doing so much beyond books. They are providing the services I've already mentioned and also providing digital literacy which is learning how to use personal devices and using creation software, information literacy skills, etc. They provide early childhood literacy, not just story times, but also 1,000 books before kindergarten, school readiness, reading, tutoring, and encouragement, summer reading programs that avoid summer slide, homework help, after-school activities, homework assistance, formal and informal, safe places, teen leadership, and socialization. Senior socialization, gathering places. There is a book titled Palaces for the People that gives a summary about the importance of having such spaces for seniors in the community. Civil discourse and community engagement, that's bringing people together, reducing division, promoting and understanding, encouraging community involvement, things such as community gardens and positive changes. Health and wellness programs and resources, exercise classes, exercise equipment. Perry Library has Borrow a Bike program. Winterset Library does a Jerry Fit program, and many of our other libraries do too, but that's an exercise program specifically for seniors. Maybe you do that here, I don't know. Mitchellville has actual exercise equipment in its library for the public to use. And then lifelong learning, book discussion groups, historical presentations, entertainment, musical events, preservation and promotion of local history, etc. Another thing that your library has in regards to economic development is free access to Foundation Directory Online. Foundation Directory Online. This has been provided recently to all public libraries in Iowa through federal funding given to the state library. The state library saw this resource as a need that libraries could use to assist their communities. So you simply go to the library, it has to be used in-house, and with your library card, you can access grant information for your nonprofit organization. That would include your city, as well as all the other nonprofit organizations in town, churches, Kiwanis, Rotary, youth clubs, etc. They can all use this database without charge simply by having a library card. This graphic is an illustration of economic development from Dr. Mildred Warner, who is professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. Dr. Warner says these three pillars of exports, productivity, and sustainability are, quote, the pillars that form the core support of the economic development edifice. With too much or too little investment in any one of the three, the structure becomes unstable. Where I see libraries in all of this is under that far right pillar, under sustainability. Public investment, you see across the bottom, public investment and planning process, that shows the ideal of economic development. But this pillar on the right includes quality of life, recreation, programming, meeting and studying space, quality resources, all of those programs I mentioned just a moment ago. Human development, again, information, education, school and career development, lifelong learning, and environment. Many libraries in our state include green aspects or blue zones, providing resources that others don't have to buy or toss into the landfill. So imagine what happens to the structure when that end pillar of sustainability is underfunded or cut out. Okay, let's get to the next one there. I like this quote. It comes from the EU, but it still certainly applies to libraries in the U.S. Public libraries are key to democratic development, learning, and literacy. They empower diverse populations and provide spaces and access to knowledge to support people's own development. Every year, the National Library Week is observed in April. This is an annual week-long event. The 2019 theme was Libraries Equal Strong Communities. At the League of Cities Conference, I encouraged attendees to go back to their communities and talk with their library director about how the city or county could really celebrate and acknowledge the value of local public libraries. So let me know if you need more information about that. I can share that. These were some 5 practical things I told the attendees of the League of Cities Conference that they could go back and do in their communities to help build those good relationships. Excuse me. So these were tips to build relationships with your library. First of all, visit it. Number 2, get a library card and use it. Number 3, include the library director in city or county planning and or city department head meetings. Number 4, appoint a city council liaison to attend library board meetings. And number 5, invite library directors to give updates at city and county meetings. The one that serves all Iowans is the green box, and the state data center in the orange box is where you can access all kinds of demographic information for your community. And the blue box is where the library services network falls, and that's the portion of our state library that I fall under. And when I talk about most of our resources for public libraries, that's the box or the area of the state library I'm referring to. Like all other 50 states, we do have a state librarian position. We have about 12 consultants. I mentioned earlier we have 6 district consultants, but we also have some other consultants that specialize in just one area. Those of us in the field as a district consultant are the generalists, so we know a lot about a lot. They know an intense amount about 1 or 2 subjects. More than that, I'm on camera. They know a lot. Yes, you all know a lot. But the point is, like, for instance, we have our continuing ed consultant. That's the only thing she focuses on. We have a youth services consultant. That's the only thing she focuses on. So she's not the person you can contact if you wanted to know about accreditation or trustee training. So, okay. You guys are great. We have a designated law librarian, and as I said at the beginning, we are not an authoritative or regulatory agency. We are here for education, to support, provide information, and to administer distribution of state tax dollars for public libraries. This is the way that the state is divided into 6 districts. Each has its own degreed librarian serving as a consultant. Contact information is readily available on our website. We not only provide information and education for public library staff and trustees, but we're also available to answer questions from the general public and or city and county staff and administrators. When opportunity is given, we welcome the chance to provide training for library boards and city administrators' councils as a large group. This is what we're doing here today. The state library routinely offers continuing education training for our library staff and boards, and much of this is equally useful and applicable for city or county staff. For example, we did an entire training series in 2017 on the topic of budgets and finance, budgets and funding. And I'm sure those can be useful recordings for council members or new clerks to view in order to fully understand how the library's budget differs from other city department budgets. You can contact me directly if you want links to any of that information or want to see where this is on our website. I will just say you can see the breadcrumb trail across the top there. You click on the blue For Libraries box, letter C for continuing ed, and then you'll see that little box where you can click the webinar archives. So with that, I shared my contact information with everyone and had business cards, and I have that for you as well. Now that's the bulk of what I did at the Iowa League of Cities conference. You can see that didn't take all of our first hour. So I don't know if you want to stretch for a moment, grab another donut. There's still half of that really good pumpkin donut out there. Or if you want to just plow through, I've got the 10 questions that were submitted to me. You're shaking your head. I'm not sure.
Keep going.
Keep on. Just keep on. So I did have question and answer time at the League of Cities conference, but I'm going to plug in the 10 questions that were specifically sent to me. And as I understand these questions, I think Laura was the spearhead of contacting everybody and saying, if you've got a question for Maryann, send it to me. I'll just collect them all and send them to her on one document, which was very helpful. And I appreciated having the questions in advance, just because that way, if there's something I have to look up, I can do it and I can have the answer ready for you. Otherwise, you might ask the question, oh, I know that's in such and such back in my office, I'll have to get back with you. And that's just a hassle, because then I have to get back with you and you have to wait for the answer, and maybe not everybody gets that answer. So I appreciated that I had these in advance. Okay. Before I answer them, I have to share this, because it's just so good. I love it. I teach the public library management class, and one of the students just gave this description of the state library when she outlined the various team members I mentioned earlier. She said, the state library of Iowa is like a fairy godmother that helps the city board and director make their library the best that those groups are willing and able to make it. And so I shared this with my colleagues. I said, look at this, isn't this great? And they go, oh, we want shirt. No, we want wands. But I think this student, and she's a new director. Public library management classes are required for new directors who don't have a master's in library science. So it's really a cram course in librarianship, 2-semester course they have to take. Quite a bit of extensive education we make our directors go through. But she really hit the nail on the head. And the interesting thing This was not something she just verbatim quoted from me when I taught the class. This was her observation. This part, that we're here to help you make things the best they can be, but only as these groups are willing and able to make it happen. So what I do as a consultant is I go and I provide information, legal information, information from the auditor's office, information from the League of Cities, information from the Attorney General's office, information prepared from the trustees handbook, which was written in conjunction and consultation with all of those groups. And I'll say, here's what this says, here's the best way to do this. And oftentimes the library boards or the city will go, oh yeah, that's good, that's good. And as soon as I leave the door, I'm not doing that. So it's as you're willing and able to make these things happen. So I do want to mention that many answers to your questions are already available on our website on the page called Library Law FAQs. And again, that's available on our website. You see the URL, statelibraryofiowa.org, and if you click the blue box and then the letter L for Library Law FAQ, you'll get there. This page has been prepared by our law librarian, who is an invaluable resource and wealth of information for our organization. So here is question number 1. When is it appropriate, if ever, for the library director to be denied access to the city attorney, and who has that authority? And I'm just, again, sticking to script here so both groups receive the same information. This would be a local policy and procedure, and as such, it should be readily conveyed to all the city departments and department heads. Our law librarian, Mandy Easter, told me that according to the Iowa League of Cities, some municipalities have written protocols or long-standing practices that dictate how agency staff may interact with the city attorney. So, how to proceed can be a uniquely local policy. Because a city is ultimately legally liable for what its employees do, and that includes the library director, the city should have a vested interest in making its attorney readily available to department heads. Some cities contract with private attorneys or firms for city attorney services, and the contract fee pays for a certain number of attorney hours per month. That's how that was set up when I was director. With this type of arrangement, it's important for the city administrator to track which employees are using up billable hours so that actual use doesn't exceed the number of contracted hours, forcing the city to go over budget. When it is necessary to restrict access to the city's attorney, there are often procedures in place to determine who really needs legal advice and whose questions might be adequately answered in a different way. Conventional wisdom dictates that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. In other words, it's far better to pay for the city attorney's time to prevent a lawsuit or a public relations debacle than to discourage contact with the city attorney and wind up paying for many attorney hours fighting lawsuits or attempting to repair the damage done to a city agency. So question 2, who, if anyone outside of library director and city attorney, should appropriately get involved in personnel matters with library staff? Does that change of the issue rises to the level of a possible termination? So if the city has a human resources specialist, herein after referred to as HR, and I believe your city does have such a person on staff, that person should definitely be involved in city agencies' personnel issues and actions that can potentially carry the threat of litigation, including the legal minefield of termination. I don't believe that city attorneys typically become involved in terminations, which is what this question is implying. But if HR has a specific legal question or senses a potential legal situation, it's a good idea to consult with the city attorney. According to the Iowa League of Cities and Iowa Workforce Development, the 2 most important pieces of policy advice in regard to employment termination is to make sure all job performance issues have been properly documented, and to make sure you call your city attorney early in the process. Again, we recommend calling your city attorney if you don't have a city HR specialist. Legal terminations result from reductions in force, like layoffs, unsatisfactory performance, which is the failure to perform up to standards in completing assigned work or to maintain satisfactory attendance, Or terminations can result from misconduct, which includes a wide range of misbehavior such as theft, fighting, drinking, or using illegal drugs on the job, refusal to carry out an order, or various other violations of the employer's work rules. Every termination should be well documented. Performance-related firing should be preceded by aggressive discipline and graduated penalties and a paper trail of poor evaluations, along with documented attempts to improve unsatisfactory performance. On our library law FAQ page, which I mentioned earlier, we state that the library should call the city attorney in a termination situation. I believe the phrase, make sure you call your city attorney, is in there because while not all cities have an HR director, all cities hopefully have a designated city attorney. The way the library's ordinance is set up, and that ordinance, as we noted earlier, is based upon state law. The library board has authority to hire the director and to authorize the director to hire other library staff. So as I originally stated, the city's HR specialist should be involved in issues of termination, and I would also say in issues of reprimand. I contacted 3 directors of 3 larger, well-run libraries in the metro area, all of which have HR departments, and all of which have had at least one library employee reprimand and or termination, in order to learn how they interact with their city's HR department. All of them work to some extent with their HR department, the city HR department. Or I should say, the HR department works with the library concerning library employee aspects. So this is information from Urbandale Public Library. The director told me the library follows the practices of the city, that the HR person sits in on meetings with any potentially controversial problems concerning library employees. But the director was quick to add that the library conducts library employee interviews without the HR person. She said the HR director has been in the room when dismissal of employees was necessary. She then added, the library always has the final decision to terminate an employee. She said the HR director has always walked through the process of termination because the library wants to ensure that all of its steps and processes will adhere to HR laws and guidelines. From West Des Moines, that director said the HR plays a very active role in monitoring how we handle hiring and dismissal. And from Waukee, I work with HR directly on hiring positions and creating or revising job descriptions. I then have my board approve the annual compensation plans and new job descriptions before they go to city council. So as you can see, all these libraries work with their HR departments as city team members. The HR directors seem to understand library board's authority over library directors and library directors' authority as city department heads over library staff.
We don't have an HR department here,
You have an HR person, specialist of some type?
only through insurance.
Okay, all right,
I have to disagree with that, and I'm sorry, but we do have HR, it's handled at the city manager's office, and there's a group of 3 of us that deal with all of the HR issues.
But
Yeah.
when I asked if there was an HR person I could talk to, the answer was no.
So that's why we say
And that was
contact the
asked
city
several
attorney
times.
if there isn't an HR option. So maybe there's a lack of communication there, which hopefully some of what we're talking about today can help better improve that situation.
Can I just clarify that from
Yeah,
a
sure.
personnel policy standpoint? There is most definitely in the personnel policies, which authority those apply to the city?
There is no what?
Do the personnel policies apply to the library? Do you have, okay. I thought they did, but I just wanted to confirm. So there is like an FMLA coordinator in City Hall, and that's most definitely in those policies, and that would be the person that would handle all potential FMLA leaves, ADA leaves. They also, I mean, Gina and Al, I mean, especially Gina handles a lot of the personnel issues here without being de facto HR. So just to clarify, my firm is privately contracted to be the city
Okay.
attorney, so
Okay.
that's my understanding of how that works.
Okay. So it could just be, again, what I said earlier about making sure all the department heads are aware of the same information.
Yep.
Okay, question number 3. In small towns, it is not unusual for city officials to be friends with city employees, and I'll say that happens in big towns too. In that case, would you recommend the city official recuse him or herself to make sure personal feelings don't play a role, or even to avoid the possibility of the look of impropriety during personnel judgment call. Personally speaking, if I were in that situation as a city leader, including being a library director, I would consider recusing myself simply to protect my reputation as a true professional. I also wouldn't want to give anyone ready ammunition to legally challenge my professional decisions by suing over my possible personal biases and asking the courts to sort it out. If the city has appropriate policies and procedures in place, it makes it easier to understand what to do and how to do it in these types of situations. If the city's HR director or attorney is doing his or her job and the city department heads are doing their jobs as supervisors, then city officials really shouldn't need to be directly involved in personnel issues other than those concerning their own supervisees. Question 4, in your experience with small communities, is the library responsible for unemployment charges to be paid out of the salaries budget? Again, it seems this is under the purview of the city's administration, which is free to set its own policies and procedures for its city departments. The policies and procedures should be the same for all departments regarding this particular matter, though, I would think. Admittedly, I have not had a lot of experience in this area simply because libraries have not contacted me about this issue. And I would defer this question to the Iowa Department of Labor, the Iowa Workforce Development, and or the Iowa League of Cities. I can provide you with contact information to any of those resources should you need it. Question 5. Does a public library director in Iowa have authority to fire a library staff member? If so, what proves this authority? Is the authority of the library director in Independence different from the library director's authority in other other Iowa cities? So I'm referring now to my very beat-up copy of the Iowa Library Trustees Handbook. This is a printout of it. It is freely, as I mentioned earlier, freely available on our website. Again, click that blue For Libraries box, go to letter T for trustees, and you'll find it there. And I just want to preface this by saying the Iowa Library Trustees Handbook was written in full consultation with other knowledgeable state agencies, including the Department of Management, the Attorney General's Office, and the State Auditor's Office, in addition to organizations that advise local governments, such as the Iowa League of Cities and the Iowa State Association of Counties, among others. The information contained in the handbook does not simply represent the opinions or desires of state library staff. The handbook contains valid, objective legal information based upon authoritative interpretations of state law, opinions of the Iowa Attorney General, and decisions of the Iowa Supreme Court. So I will refer to our Trustees Handbook, Chapter 12, which is entitled Hiring a Library Director. This is the roundabout way of answering this question, but I think you need this background information so you can see why it's being answered this way. This is a quote from that Chapter 12, Hiring a Library Director. And this is advice to information to trustees. Before hiring a library director, the entire board should have a good grasp of what a public library director does. The library director is the department head of a city service whose responsibilities include that they hire and supervise personnel. Elsewhere, the chapter recommends to the library board that it consider director applicants' qualifications in the area of, quote, management or supervisory experience, end quote. It recommends that boards, quote, develop a list of questions to be asked of every candidate interviewed, and topics to cover in the interview include management and fiscal philosophy, among others, end quote. Director applicants' areas of expertise to be evaluated by the board include, quote, successful record of working with board and community leaders and supervising staff. In Chapter 14 of the Trustees Handbook, that chapter is entitled The Board's Relationship with Library Staff, and it says, quote, the only employee who reports directly to the board is the library director, end quote. It goes on to say, quote, the director is responsible for hiring, supervising, evaluating, and if necessary, disciplining and dismissing staff, end quote. And that section from Chapter 14 then gives this instruction, again, a quote. The director is accountable to the board for the performance of all staff. Employees need to clearly understand, and this is library employees, need to clearly understand the authority of the library director, who is accountable to whom and who has responsibility for what. The board hires the director to be the expert in management of the library, including the management of all other personnel. As a department head, the library director has supervisory authority over other library personnel. Supervisory authority seems to include disciplinary and termination authority, although, as I already said, the city's HR specialist should be involved in termination issues. While every city may have different policies and procedures for department heads, in the state library's experience, most of the city's 543 cities with public libraries do acknowledge that the library director is the supervisor over all library staff, and as such has typical supervisory authority, including interviewing, hiring, evaluating, disciplining, and terminating employees. Question 6, does a library board in Iowa have the authority to establish the library director's job description? If so, what proves this authority? Is the authority of the library board in independence different from the board's authority in other Iowa cities? So the development of the library director's job description is most often, in my experience as a consultant, done by the library board. However, if the city has an HR specialist, it is certainly advisable for the board to work with that HR person to develop an appropriate department head job description. In my recent communication with the Waukee Library Director, she said, I work with HR directly on hiring positions and creating or revising job descriptions. It is certainly advisable for a library board to likewise work with its city's HR specialist in developing a job description for the director. But again, as we previously noted, library boards have tremendous authority over the library and over the library director. So it should be the library board that approves the director's job description, and it should in turn be the library board's responsibility to ensure that the director's job description adheres to the city's personnel policies. The library board's responsibility for developing the director's job description is derived from the city library ordinance. And your library's ordinance does seem to be like most of the other 543 public library ordinances, with the exception of the 3 or so that I mentioned earlier that do not have advisory boards, or that have advisory boards instead of administrative boards. So yeah, just looking at your ordinance, it looks very typical. Those were all developed around the same time as home rule, and so once you find good verbiage, you just keep using it, right? Libraries are great about sharing. I would recommend you see your ordinance 115.06 section 4 for the duties of the library board regarding its charge of overseeing the library director. Your library's ordinance, as we said earlier, was adopted by your city council, but it can only be amended by a vote of your citizens at a public referendum. The ordinance is subject to Iowa Code section 392.5. In 2018, the state library did an entire series of continuing ed webinars on the topic of HR, and one of those sessions was all about the development of job descriptions, so I encourage you to view that if you have additional questions on this topic. One of the other sessions in that was all about dealing with difficult employee situations, such as discipline and termination, and we did have an attorney come in to do that presentation. It's an attorney that specializes in employee issues, so that's also archived on our website in the 2018 section. Question 7, the Library Board of Trustees approves library expenditures. Does the City Council have any legally recognized authority to disapprove expenditures approved by the Library Board? Is it necessary for the City Council to approve those same bills prior to them being paid? If you were all listening, you should be able to answer this, because I talked about that in that presentation. So let me just reiterate and give you some more resources as to why we say what we do. In 2017, the State Library presented a 5-part training series of webinars about library budgets and finance. I think I already mentioned these. In the webinar titled Library Budgets and the Law, Mandy Easter, our law librarian, and I addressed both of these questions that you have here on the slide. A recording of that webinar is currently available as an archived webinar on our website. I sound like an infomercial. I'm just saying the same thing. Go to our website, go to our website. Call now. Let me know if you want the link to that presentation. So Chapter 9, again referring back to the Iowa Library Trustees Handbook, was written with the aid and approval of the State Auditor's Office. That chapter is entitled Library Funding, Finance, and Budget. It includes a chart showing that the library board approves monthly expenditures and is ultimately and legally responsible for how library funds are spent. The chart shows that the city clerk is responsible only for paying invoices approved by the library board and for providing the library with monthly reports showing expenditures and the status of the budget. The city council and mayor are responsible only for appropriating the bottom line funding for the library. Since by ordinance the board has total authority over how the library's money is spent, the most the city council can do in way of approving library expenditures is to rubber stamp the trustees' prior approval as a mere formality. While the city clerk and council should be kept informed of the library's expenditures and the status of the library's budget on a monthly basis, the council has no real legally recognizable power to disapprove expenditures already approved by the library board. So if the city clerk insists on waiting for the council's formal approval before paying the library's invoices, this is legally unnecessary once the library board has approved their payment. According to the Iowa League of Cities Clerks Manual, after the board approves library bills and the general operation of the library, and I'm quoting here, the library director should coordinate information with the city finance officer to ensure the bills are added to the list of claims provided to the city council and published. This ensures that the expenditures are published in accordance with requirements of the Iowa Code and that the general ledger is kept current. And in case you're not catching as I read through this kind of legalese, this is why city councils approve the library's bills. While this is not mandated, both the auditor of the state and the State Library of Iowa encourage this preferred method, and that's what the clerk's manual says coming from Iowa League of Cities. Still quoting from that. As with any other department, the library cannot spend more than has been allocated unless the budget is formally amended. Accordingly, the library and the city must work together to determine whether a formal budget amendment is required to account for possible expenditure overtures or unanticipated revenues. It is often beneficial for the city council to receive a monthly or quarterly financial report from the library board to ensure the library's budget is fiscally sound, end quote. So the reason the city council approves the library's expenditure is to formally acknowledge that certain funds have been spent, not to give its permission for the funds to be spent. Now this next section I'm going to tell you ties in with a different issue, but it's very much related to this because the basis of this question is, can city council disapprove an expenditure that the board has approved, that the library board has approved? This next section ties in with that. It also ties in with the authority of the library board over the city library director. So there was an issue with a city council in Iowa denying or disapproving a library board's decision to give its library director a raise. Raises are budgetary decisions, of course, and because they require an expenditure of the library's budget. The mayor of this particular town consulted with a private law firm whose attorney wrote a letter to that mayor, which says in part, and I'm quoting from this attorney's letter, in essence, it is within the library board's sole authority and discretion to set the compensation of the library director. Such a decision is not without the purview of the council, and the position of library director is not under the control or authority of the council. As it pertains to the library itself, the council has the authority to set the budget for the library board. However, it is up to the library board to determine how such funds are spent and to do so without the need or requirement for council approval. I would therefore suggest that the specifics of the library board's decision to increase compensation, including discussions where the library director is referred to by name, not be discussed during a council meeting. Also, as the library director is not a position under the control or supervision of the council, a closed session regarding such discussion would not be appropriate, end quote. That all from the attorney's letter. Additionally, there is a formal opinion of the Iowa Attorney General dated January 21st, 1988 that responds to questions from the Davis County Attorney here in Iowa pertaining to the Bloomfield City Council's passage of an amendment to the library's ordinance forcing the library board to comply with the city's personnel policies, rules, regulations, and salary scales. The Attorney General concluded, quote, a restriction on a library board of trustees' authority to set the compensation of library personnel in an ordinance which previously granted exclusive control over expenditures and compensation to the library board would constitute an alteration of the charge of a library board as used in Iowa Code Section 392.5 and would be void absent approval by referendum. So that's the end quote from the Attorney General's opinion. Both of these opinions contradict a city council's claim that it can interfere with the city's, let me start that again. Both of these opinions contradict a city council's claim that it can interfere with the library board's authority to set staff compensation levels. So since staff compensation levels are budgetary issues, we can surely conclude, going back to this question, that any challenges by the city council to the library board's approval of library expenditures would likely be subject to the same Attorney General's opinion. That's a long way of answering that question.
And I think part of the question that we're not getting to here, just so everybody's on the same page, I don't believe the city council has ever questioned approving the expenditures. We are operating under the pretense that the state auditor has told us that the city council must give us authorization to write checks, not approve expenditures. The expenditure question, I don't think from the council perspective has ever been in question. The library board has the complete authority over expenditures. You've made that very clear, and I appreciate it. But I don't think we have an issue with that. We do have an issue with the state auditor's office telling us that the city council has to give us authority to write those checks.
Our
Okay.
city code chapter 17 states that as well.
Okay, so that,
It's just the way that you said is recommended. It's the process,
right.
but it's what we're directed to, not just for the library, but for everybody. How do
So
we write those
that
checks?
sounds like it goes to a somewhat related question. Go ahead.
I think everything's compliant with what she's saying though.
Oh, yeah,
Because
absolutely.
it sounds like to me the city council is just rubber stamping.
Right.
And that's what you said.
That's
You know,
what
these
it
are like, I'm
sounds
jotting
like.
down all these notes furiously and it sounds like everything is actually, I'm happy.
Well,
I think the problem comes in when there are bills that are due.
That's what I was just going to say. This is a common issue. Because the library board approves it, it goes off to City Hall, pay the bill, the board's already approved it, that's all you need, and it sits there. And it waits for the next council meeting, and then finally gets paid. I speak from experience. Okay, so let me share, I've got some notes here, I may have to jump around here, but let me just start here. The state auditor's office, since you quoted that, such a great segue, says that if it becomes a problem getting routine bills paid on time because they come due before the next board meeting, trustees can pass a resolution or adopt a policy giving the director permission to submit to the city clerk for payment without signatures any normal expenditures already approved in the annual budget. These might include utility bills or materials that fall within that budget. However, the director must still present these bills at the next board meeting for formal approval so that they're listed in the total accounting of library funds. Any out of the ordinary or particularly expensive purchases should always be submitted for board approval prior to payment. And that kind of goes into, I guess I'll just leave some more.
Wait, can I just clarify so I want to make sure I understand that before you move on. So the process could be that the library board would give the authority to Laura to just approve those normal expenditures and then she would take it on to the clerk and it would run through council. So we could plan that way.
Right.
To get it, but we would
That's
still get
what-
it rubber stamped by council.
Right, and that's what question 8 ties in with. Can the library board pre-approve credit card and other time-sensitive bills to avoid late fees? Or kind of tweak that a little bit, could the library director submit those bills for early payment earlier than what the board approval would come? So I briefly mentioned this answer in the last question, but let me expound more. This is a situation, as I mentioned, I personally dealt with as a library director. My library was constantly receiving overdue notices and being charged late fees because although the library board would approve the bills and I would deliver them to City Hall in a timely fashion, the bills would sit on the finance director's desk waiting formal approval from the city council. We've already noted that formal approval wasn't necessary to get a bill paid. Because of the timing difference between library board meetings and the city council meetings, the bills would end up getting paid late. At the time, I consulted with the then library service area consultant who was in a position similar to what I do now, but those library service areas no longer exist. And I asked him, what can I do? He advised adopting a policy that would allow me to, having the board adopt a policy that would allow me to submit customary and anticipated bills that fell within the already established and approved library budget and which might be subject to late fees, to submit those bills to City Hall prior to formal approval at a library board meeting in order to avoid late payment. Of course, the bills were formally submitted and approved by the board at the following board meeting, but this policy enabled the library to avoid late fees, which in turn saved the city money and a good reputation. During a 2016 webinar about open meetings law, such practice was approved as legal by the Iowa Public Information, whose director, who is also an attorney, was our guest presenter in that webinar. So does that clarify?
Yep, that makes perfect
Okay.
sense.
So question 9. Who has the authority to determine and approve the salaries, I should say, or salary ranges for library employees? I'll have to correct that. So I already answered this. I hope you caught that in the presentation. And I already read to you that attorney's letter to the mayor as well as the Attorney General's 1988 opinion, but let me just add a little bit extra to that. Additional information pertaining to this topic is also available on our library law FAQ page under the question that asks, can the library board offer employment benefits to the library's employees that are different from the benefits offered to other city employees? So here's the additional information noted for that question, which also adds information to this question about who sets the salaries and compensation of library employees. The typical library city ordinance gives wide authority, or I should say the city's library ordinance, gives wide authority and broad powers to library boards and trustees to manage their city libraries, including the ability to make expenditures and compensate employees. And again, I'll just insert that your ordinance just does seem to be very typical. Again, going back to the library law FAQ page, I'm going to quote directly from that, and you can look this up on your own. However, library employees are first and foremost city employees. So at a minimum, their pay and benefits must comply with local ordinances and state and federal laws, and their compensation levels must be commensurate with other similarly situated city employees. As city employees, library employees are eligible for all benefits offered to city employees in their same employee classification. Typical classifications are full-time, part-time, temporary, and seasonal, although cities are free to define their own classifications. For instance, one city may define full-time as working 40 hours, and another may define 30 hours per week as full-time. The Iowa League of Cities advises, it is important to carefully define employee classifications and to be consistent in offering benefits. A city does not have the flexibility to offer health coverage to some full-time employees and not to others, nor can it offer different levels of benefits to its full-time employees. The only exception to this is in the case of collective bargaining agreements, which may supersede the employee classifications. Do you have a union here? Okay, so let me go on with this. For example, a union group of employees may negotiate for a different level of benefits than that of non-union employees. Again, consistency within classes is very important. Some cities agree to pay for both single and family coverage, others pay for single but not family. Each city must make a determination as to what benefits it wants to offer and be consistent. The Iowa Insurance Division staff says that Iowa Code sections 505.21 and 509.1 state definitively, one, that employers must offer their employees access to insurance benefits, and 2, those benefits cannot be offered in a discriminatory manner. Subsection 509.11a states, the employees eligible for insurance under the policy shall be all of the employees of the employer or all of any class or classes thereof determined by conditions pertaining to their employment. And then it goes on and it talks about Federal Equal Pay Act, etc. That kind of answers that question, I think. Probably more than you wanted. And question 10, that's the last question. Oh, this is just a screenshot of your ordinance. And so you can see number 4 is very typical of other library ordinance. This is one of the charges of a library board in hiring personnel, and it does say midway, and to fix their compensation. But it goes on to say, provided that prior to such employment, employment, the compensation of the librarian, assistants, and employees shall have been fixed and approved by a majority of the members of the board voting in favor thereof. So, again, this is an issue where you're working together. Because I know as a director, if I wanted a new employee, even if I felt we had the money in the budget, I always went to the city because I wanted to make sure I wasn't forgetting any of those taxes and insurance and everything else that are those fees that you don't think about, all those hidden fees. The reason why your paycheck never is as big as what the gross amount says. So I wanted to make sure all of that was covered, and that we had the proper provisions and legal aspects and all of that taken care of. So question 10. Is it legal to record an open meeting without the consent or knowledge of the meeting participants? I'm referring to Iowa Code section 21.7, which is entitled Rules of Conduct at Meetings, and it says this, quote, "The public may use cameras or recording devices at any open session. Nothing in this chapter shall prevent a governmental body from making and enforcing reasonable rules for the conduct of its meetings to assure those meetings are orderly and free from interference or interruption by spectators." So I'm not interpreting law here, I'll leave that to you, but basically, if you lost it in the translation here, you can use public cameras or recording devices at any open session, but the operating board meeting does have a right to say, you're being really unruly. I guess if somebody's running around with the camera and they're zooming in, they could say, could you sit that in the corner maybe? And just be a little more well-behaved with that. We have found, meaning the state library, we have found no provision in state law that requires a public meeting observer to gain the consent of the public body before recording its meeting. There is likewise nothing that says an attendee planning to record the meeting must give notice to the public body. The state library knows of several city clerks in the state who either record all city board and commission meetings, including library board meetings themselves, or insist that the boards and commissions give them recordings of each meeting. And by order of the city attorney, those recordings are kept in a vault for several years as a precaution against litigation. There are also many city clerks who record every one of their city council meetings in order to write up notes later because they're so busy with procedural activities in the actual meeting that it's impossible to take notes. Some library boards do likewise for the same reason. While these are official procedures and therefore known to board, commission, and council members, anyone with a cell phone can surreptitiously record anything. So it's prudent to assume that when acting in a public capacity, there is a chance that what you say and do will end up on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or any number of other social media outlets. We as state employees have the same assumptions, and we are also subject to public record requests. So it is legally ethical to record a public meeting, but sometimes ethics are personal. I would say the manner of such a recording being deemed unethical would depend on the expectations of the library trustees. Keep in mind, though, that library trustees are public servants acting in a public open meeting. That's all I had. We did great with the time here. There again is my contact information. Your district consultant from Northeast District is Eunice Reesberg. So I would recommend you call her with any library-related questions, unless you just have a question specifically about something I said, or question me about pumpkin donuts, because I'm really particular about them and have certain criteria for them. So that does leave us with some time. I'm happy to answer questions to the best of my ability, or to refer back to some of the notes or the resources I brought with me, or to jot down your question and say, you know what, let me get back to you on that. So we finished early. We had allocated until 11:30. So it's up to you. It's a beautiful day outside. Maybe you want to get home and rake leaves or enjoy the outdoors.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
When you say HR specialist or HR department of the city, would that typically mean that those people have a certain amount of education or background in HR in order to be able to assist in any HR?
Most of the time when a city has something designated like that, that it is known as the HR department or the HR specialist or the HR person, that person does have that expertise and background, and that's the only thing they do.
Like a
that's their
degree, and that's
primary
what they
job.
do.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when I was referring to those other cities and how they interact with their HR departments, that's the kind of setup they have.
Thank you.